to welcome Leah Palmer today as our speaker, and she is going to talk about art conservation, what it is, who does it, and why does it matter. Leah, take it away.
All right, I am going to share my screen and let me know if you can see this slideshow coming up right here. Linda, can you see that?
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
All right. So right now, I want everyone to take a moment and just kind of think about an object that has made you feel something. Maybe this is an artifact that you saw in a museum. Maybe it's a piece of pottery that had a fingerprint on it that made you feel connected to an ancient maker who's no longer alive. Or maybe you visited a historical site that you went to with your family, or there's a lot of people there and you felt this kind of sense of awe. Or maybe it's something closer to home, like a perfume that your mom gave you that reminds you of her, or a book that you got that still smells like your childhood library. Well, an object that has made me feel something is this. These are Abraham Lincoln's assassination garments. And these are the articles of clothing that President Lincoln was wearing when he was assassinated. And I treated these garments when I was an art conservation intern at the National Park Service in 2021. And this was such a special experience because as I buttoned up his vest and his frock coat, I thought to myself that the last person to button these things up was Abraham Lincoln himself. So my name is Leah Palmer, and I am a second-year student in the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. And this moment of awe and joy and excitement and connectivity that we get when we communicate and interact with objects is the thing that brought me into the field of art conservation, which is a field that allows me to very closely interact with objects of special significance. So over the next 45 minutes, we are going to discuss what art conservation is, what it entails, where it happens. We're going to talk about who does art conservation, how do people become art conservators, and then very briefly at the end, we're going to wrap up with why does art conservation matter in a world where there are so many arguably bigger things to fix? Why do we spend hours, weeks, and years repairing old art? Well, I am really passionate about this field because I believe that conservation of objects allows for these transformative and connective experiences between artworks and humanity. I believe that objects create empathy between people and they bring us beauty in our lives. And I think both of those things are things that our world needs a lot more of. So what is art conservation? What springs to mind when I say those words? Maybe you have heard of something like this. These are paintings conservators hard at work in Amsterdam at the Rijksmuseum, taking care of Rembrandt's famous painting, The Night Watch. Maybe you've seen people piecing together broken shards of a ceramic. That's a very clear example of conservation. And maybe you've heard of this. This is a botched conservation attempt of a fresco in Spain called the Ecce Homo, a very famous conservation attempt. And all of these things could fall under the umbrella of art conservation in a way. And we also probably know what conservation means in just a general everyday sense. We have a careful preservation or protection of something, and we talk about ecological conservation, and in physics, a conservation of mass. So the concept of keeping something around. Today, the American Institute for Conservation defines our field in this way. Conservation encompasses all of the actions taken towards the long-term preservation of cultural heritage. Activities can include examination, documentation, treatment, and preventive care, supported by research and education. So I'm going to take a second and address a question that may be arising in your heads. What's the difference between restoration and conservation? So restoration is focused on caring for objects, just like conservation, but restoration is a more interventive, potentially aggressive way of sometimes irreversibly making an object look more like new. Whereas conservation has a respect for the history of the object. And the treatments are maybe more minimal, not as aggressive. And any treatment is usually designed to be reversible. If somebody in the future doesn't like what we did, we can reverse it. And conservators think of our field as standing on three pillars. And there are more pillars than this, but these are kind of core. Conservation involves science, so the understanding of the material characteristics of artworks and objects and how they degrade and how conservation treatments will affect them. And science also comes into play when thinking about the analysis of artworks. Conservation also involves art history. There's a level of connoisseurship and background knowledge that is really essential when caring for and making decisions about how to treat artworks. And then finally, conservation can involve studio art. Conservation treatments really require manual dexterity and understanding of how artist materials are used, and both of those things are really cultivated when doing studio art. So we're going to talk a little bit just briefly about some conservation treatments that are more famous that you may have heard of, just to get us more familiar with what conservators do. So a treatment that some of you may have heard of is the treatment of the Tullio Lombardo sculpture of Adam. And this is a life-size sculpture that was up at the Met. And it fell and shattered. And so the treatment involved rejoining all of the separate pieces and mending it so it became more whole again. We've also experienced, maybe in your lifetime, the conservation of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And this conservation treatment that happened in the 1980s involved conservators removing layers and layers of grime and soot and previous restoration to reveal something that was actually quite different than what people thought that the ceiling looked like. And this was a little bit controversial. And then finally, if you've been to Chicago, if you've been to the Art Institute of Chicago, you've probably seen these lions standing outside. These are bronze lions that have gotten corroded over time as they've been exposed to the elements. And so these need to be conserved too. They are brought back into a warehouse, washed with water, and with a very gentle laser, the corrosion is removed, and then they're waxed and coated so that they can be better protected from the elements. So these are just a few introductory examples of conservation treatments, and we'll talk about some more later. So going back to this AIC definition of conservation, it says that conservators take care of cultural heritage. This is kind of a vague term. What is cultural heritage? Well, it can be defined as the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group or society inherited from the past. Again, this is really broad and it can kind of encompass a wide variety of things you might see in a museum, things you would find around your home, things you would see around the city. So as a result, art conservators do end up taking care of a wide variety of things. So kind of like how you have specialties in medicine, like dermatology or cardiology, conservators also specialize. Each conservator specializes in one or two of these following categories, and they become an expert in the particularities of each. So I'm going to walk through each of these and kind of briefly describe what is contained under these kind of subheadings of conservation. So paintings conservators conserve paintings. It's fairly straightforward, but they also conserve things that have paint on them that are not necessarily stretched canvases, things like murals, frescoes like the Sistine Chapel, wall paintings, reverse glass paintings, and polychrome sculptures. Paper conservators, again, conserve paper. These can include things like maps, singular documents, or groups of documents, hanging scrolls, letters, and etc. Library and archives conservators, this may feel very related to paper conservation, but there's actually some interesting considerations with this. So when researchers visit a library or an archive, the desire is to be able to use or handle the books and the materials there. So think about the Library of Congress, if you've ever been and if you've ever done research there, you're going into that space in order to handle those books and glean information from what is there. So the consideration for library and archives conservators are they're much more focused on preserving objects so that they can be used, they can be handled in the future, not just looked at. So this is something that is kind of particular to this as well. Textile conservators are focused on items made out of fabric or fibers. Think costumes, rugs, tapestries, curtains. I have right here in front on this image an archaeological textile fragment. So it used to be quite whole, but at this point, hundreds and hundreds of years after its creation, it has degraded into kind of a bundle of fibers. So textile conservators are concerned with things like this. Furniture and wooden artifacts conservators deal with kind of larger items made out of wood. In these types of labs, you tend to see things like chest of drawers, shelves, tables, chairs. We have clocks and frames. Sometimes framing conservators do their things in a different lab, but oftentimes these two categories can be joined. Photography conservation can seem straightforward, and I thought it was straightforward, but photograph conservators are concerned with a lot of different materials, not just things on paper. We have silver-plated copper daguerreotypes, salted paper prints, which is on paper, ambrotypes on glass, cellulose nitrate film negatives, and silver gelatin prints here. So lots of different things under this heading. Another specialization that includes lots of different things is objects, and this is my specialization. This is kind of a catch-all field of conservation. It encompasses anything, for the most part, that doesn't fall neatly into the other categories. Things like inorganic materials, such as glass, ceramics, and metal. Right here in this image, I'm holding a highly corroded copper alloy boss from an archaeological site in Iran, and that Constitch is a part of objects conservation. And then you have inorganic materials like leather or bone, plant material, plant fibers, etc. So again, this is a super broad area. Time-based media is something that a word you may not have heard. And this is kind of a more contemporary specialization, and it encompasses artworks that kind of escape category or definition. Time-based media artwork has duration. It unfolds to the viewer over time. And it could include things like video, film, audio, computer technology, performance, and ephemeral materials or things that are designed to degrade. One example of this is this image here. It's an artwork by Felix Gonzalez Torres, which includes a pile of candy that is designed to kind of disappear because museum goers are invited to take pieces of the candy. So the physical artwork is designed to deteriorate as part of its meaning. But the museum that owns the artwork then has to kind of think about how to take care of that. Do you replenish the candy? Do you let it go? So another form of time-based media could be performance, and performance conservators, or the conservator's job may be to figure out how to preserve aspects of that performance by recording it, notating it. Other pieces of time-based media may have a strong technological element. These technological elements could become obsolete over time as they get older and older. And so conservators may need to know less about studio art and more about technology in this case. So these treatments often require conservators to connect with an artist. They often require artist consultations to talk about what exactly we want to do for this artwork, because it's kind of unusual and treatments are so object specific. And finally, we have preventive conservation. This is another specialization that's a bit more modern and has been growing as the years progress. And this is similar to how you might think about preventive medicine. There's a lot of things that we can do for our bodies just on the day-to-day basis to keep us from having to go to the doctor or the conservator. And these things are like eating vitamins, drinking enough water, getting enough sleep, things like that. In the conservation world, preventive conservators are thinking about what we call the 10 agents of deterioration. So pollutants, fire, pests, light levels, temperature, relative humidity, dissociation, which means the information about the artifact gets separated from the artifact itself, flooding, mechanical damage, and theft. And so preventive conservators are thinking about how to mitigate all of these things to keep an object safe and secure. But then also there's a balance between how much do you mitigate all of these things like light, and how much do we allow the objects to be engaged with or on view. Obviously, maybe the safest quote unquote thing for an object would be to keep it in a dark room, but how is it then fulfilling its purpose if it's not engaging with people? So that's a question that preventive conservators are grappling with as well. So these are the 9 specializations. And again, each conservator focuses on 1 or 2 because there's so many particularities for each. So where does conservation happen? Where do we find conservation labs? Well, basically anywhere you find objects, conservators are likely to be nearby, somewhere nearby, at least in the United States. And I'm going to go back. Institutions that collect objects or have conservation happen, they collect objects for different reasons. And sometimes the conservation treatments that happen there kind of range based on the use of the objects in that institution. So for a museum, sometimes, this is not all the time, but sometimes museums are more focused on how the object looks while it's on view. And so the conservation treatment may involve a maintenance of the aesthetic appearance more so than other considerations. Library and archives, like Library of Congress, like we just talked about, these often prioritize the physical integrity of the object for research, for analysis, and for education purposes. Sometimes objects are designed to be in a collection so that researchers can come and handle them, look at them, maybe shoot them with lasers to find out something about them, or passed around in a classroom. So these may prioritize keeping them very stable so they're able to be handled. Regional centers are kind of larger areas or larger conservation labs that serve larger regions of the country. They serve institutions, museums that may not have labs. They serve private clients and other institutions that just want their objects to be conserved. And finally, private practices exist. Conservators, individual conservators who work directly with clients or who are collaborating with other conservators to serve a region or a place, or just people individually. So let's go back to this definition of art conservation. This slide is going to come up, I think, 2 more times. But this particular definition has morphed and changed quite a bit over time in the last about 100, 150 years. So I want to walk through a really brief history of conservation and talk a little bit about the present day issues that our field is engaging with. So the field that we now know today as art conservation really began in the mid 1800s, 1850s, when scientists such as Michael Faraday and Louis Pasteur started being hired by art institutions, particularly the National Gallery of London, to do some research on how to best take care of the artworks, because there's paintings there that were getting really dirty and degraded. So these scientists were kind of handpicked to answer some questions about the degradation processes. And Faraday performed research that found that pollutants in the air that were kind of up and coming because of the Industrial Revolution were causing negative effects on the paintings there. Things like sulfur and coal compounds were really casting a dark haze over the artworks. Before this time, conservation was more of a restoration-focused practice. There was kind of a wholesale desire to make things look new so that they could have saleability, so that they could look nice in a museum. There was indiscriminate restoration happening. So the introduction of scientific knowledge and processes really added a different layer to this field, and there was some more thought about why we're doing what we're doing. Conservation in America really picked up in the 1920s when Edward Forbes established the Fogg Art Museum Conservation Lab, which is at Harvard. And in this lab, there were conservation treatments being done, but also scientific analyses, things like X-radiography to look at the underlayers, the underpainting on paintings, things like ultraviolet imaging to find previous restoration. All of these things were happening. And over the next 50 years, more and more conservation labs began opening in institutions around the US. Around the 1940s, some scientific or technical journals started cropping up to kind of discuss what is the experimentation being done in the field. And also graduate programs began popping up across the US starting in the 1960s. So we have these 5 that opened within the span of these years, and Cooperstown is the only one that is no longer extant. And this picture is really lovely. It's the first graduating class of WoodPAC, and I am WoodPAC 26. So there's been a long time between now and then. So there were a few really marked changes in the ethical approaches of conservators from the 1850s to kind of the 90s, 2000s. So while the first conservators were more like restorers performing wholesale retouching, there was a move towards more minimally invasive treatments. Minimal intervention became more of a core tenet of conservation as the years went by. And there was an increased value placed on the historical patina that was accrued by the object over time. So having that light touch became more and more of a central desire. And as science advanced, so did the analyses that were open to conservators. We went from just X-radiography and UV imaging to things like 3D imaging and 3D model creation and spectroscopy, different spectroscopic analyses. And then the budding field of preventive conservation really came to the forefront as conservators were striving to be as minimally invasive as possible. So in the last few decades, conservators have paused a little bit on the concept of only prioritizing minimal intervention. And we've instead begun focusing on how people who benefit from cultural heritage can be involved and should be involved in our work. So we're moving away from like an isolation in our own labs and towards an acknowledgement that we need to be consulting and investing in and having stakeholders come to us to discuss what is best for the object. So this move is colloquially known as peoples-based or people-centric conservation. And this recognizes that conservators and curators are not the only people who are deeply invested in object. Everybody is, but specific communities are invested in specific objects. And sometimes we are not the best people to be making decisions about conservation treatments. Sometimes the best people are the descendants of the communities who created the objects, like Indigenous American tribes, or the makers themselves, like living artists. And in discussions with these groups, conservators may learn that the best way to care for an artifact is to do something that like spans the gamut of what we could do. Sometimes the best thing is to perform a really highly interventive treatment, something that we may consider to be restoration, or the treatment could involve doing nothing at all and actually letting the object degrade naturally over time, maybe as it was designed to do originally. So there's also a desire to care for intangible qualities of an object. Things like the practices, the representations, knowledge, the skills represented by an object. And sometimes this can look like repairing an object to be used again, like we talked about with library and archives conservation. Their use can be a very important part of an object. So a pop culture example of this actually is Marilyn Monroe's dress that Kim Kardashian wore at the 2022 Met Gala. So there was kind of an uproar when this happened, when Kim put on this dress that wasn't designed to fit her. And some conservators were very against this, but some actually argued that this could be a core aspect of conserving everything about the object. The fact that it was designed to be worn by a beautiful woman, the fact that Marilyn Monroe was a highly performance-oriented person. So a conservator named Jules Feldman wrote that the discipline of conservation has come to recognize that an object's integrity does not rest solely in its physical materials. So for example, Kim Kardashian's wearing of the Monroe dress may be understood as a form of conservation, perhaps not of the dress itself, but of the performance of which that dress was an integral part, and without which I argue the dress has little significance. So this concept of having the object be conserved in various ways apart from its materiality has manifested in a variety of different conservation treatments, and in particular, the conservation of ethnographic materials that were designed to be used by their community, but are now in museums and they're now static and they're kind of dead in a way. So one example of this is how their conservators in New Zealand decided to, with curators and with community members, decided to put on a set of Maori cloaks, record how they moved and how they draped as they wore them, and then that was put on display in the museum in addition to the static cloaks. So this was an attempt and a desire to conserve the intangible qualities of the object, how it moves, how it looks, maybe how it sounds. Another example of this is a couple of Woodpack students and conservators collaborated with a weaver from Alaska to repair a basket with materials that are not normally used in conservation that were food safe, so that the basket could then carry berries when it went back to its original community. So the conservation was focused on how can this object fulfill its role that it was originally designed to do, not just kind of sit on a shelf or under a vitrine. So this generation of conservators is becoming a lot more thoughtful and creative about how we can care for objects in order for them to best serve the communities that are invested in them. So this is the last time we'll see this slide, but if you ask 10 different art conservators, you'll get 10 different definitions of what conservation means to them. So I think for me, as I'm growing in my career, I'm going to tweak this definition a little bit, and I'm going to say that conservation is the holistic care of material culture, caring for both the material components as well as the intangible qualities of an object for communities that are living, that are in the present, as well as generations to come. I think there's something a lot to be said for focusing on the people who are alive, who are appreciating the objects now, and not only thinking about, well, how can we keep it around for future people? So now that we have kind of a foundation of what conservation is and where it came from, we're going to move into who does conservation. How do you become a conservator? So in the past, kind of before the graduate programs existed, you would apprentice with somebody in a particular craft profession like weaving or woodworking, and then you would kind of finagle your way into the field in that way. But now the most common thing to do and the most accepted thing to do is to get a master's degree from a degree granting program, and that usually takes around 2 to 4 years. And these programs exist all over the world. If you look, there's these little orange dots that represent one or many programs in each of these locations. But the United States has 4 institutions that are degree granting. We have Buffalo State University in New York, NYU, the UCLA Getty program, and then our program here in Wilmington, the University of Delaware program that works in conjunction with the Winterthur Museum. And each program has a lot of prerequisites, a lot of pre-program requirements that you have to complete before you can apply. So these prerequisites focus around that 3-legged stool that we talked about. We have art history and chemistry and studio art. And every aspiring conservator really fulfills these requirements in very different ways. There's a lot of various paths you can go on to get to this field, but to illustrate just one path, I'm going to walk you through my own conservation experience over the last about 10 years. So, oh yes, we have the 3 different stages. You go through your pre-program stage where you complete your prerequisites, then you get to grad school, you go to grad school, and then after that you graduate, you have your master's, then you become a conservator. So again, I'm going to walk you through my kind of career path. And I learned about this field in 2016. So I'm coming up on 10 years, which is exciting. And I decided to go to undergrad for art history. So this was my first step, was to get my art history degree. And after taking a wide variety of classes like dress in Central America, art history of Mozambique, archaeology and colonialism, I finished my degree by writing a senior thesis about how preserving color and communicating about lost color is really important in conservation treatments and in conservation science. My chemistry coursework I completed in undergrad, and I did general and organic chemistry and lab work. And so this requirement is really great because it informed me about how the micro properties of materials really impacts their macro properties. And it informed me about how different materials, different substances engage with each other. And this is key in thinking about how you treat art materials with conservation materials. I also took some coursework in studio art, and I did a lot of studio art in my own time and worked on commission. I did things like embroidery and clothing making and sketching and digital art, which I really love. And then the New York University program in conservation requires a language fluency. So I took Arabic and studied abroad in Morocco when I was an undergrad, and I also took French and studied abroad in the south of France, which was really great. I don't currently use either of these languages, but it was a really great time, and some of it has come in handy when looking at objects that have French or Arabic writing on them. So after graduation, I moved into my lab work portion of my conservation prerequisites, and I got a position at the National Park Service where I did a lot of treatment, hands-on treatment or bench work. And the objects that came through these labs all came from collections from various national parks throughout the country. So these included things like a painted banner from the Vietnam War Memorial. Also included Abraham Lincoln's assassination garment. So I'm going to talk about this treatment just a little bit. So these garments came to us, and it was his vest, his frock coat, his trousers, and then his bow tie, which you see here. So I did a couple of different things for this object when I was there. I stabilized each of the components of his garments. Some of them were splitting at the hems. This image is an image of his cuff that was splitting, and so I stitched that so that it was more stable. Some of the areas were made of silk, and silk tends to shatter or fall apart when it degrades and gets older. And when you take the clothes on and off a mannequin enough times, that shattering silk starts to degrade even further and maybe fall off. So I tacked down or sewed down some sheer pieces of material over these areas so that that material provides a barrier between the mannequin that it would go on and the fabric itself. And then the bow tie had some wrinkled straps. So I humidified that. I made it more flexible. And then I flattened those straps so that they looked a little bit more neat and tidy. But the bow tie was too fragile to be put on display with the rest of the ensemble. So I created a mount for it. And then this bow tie would be put on display in that mount. So I created an acrylic mount. I sanded it, I hand polished it, and then I created a little safe box for it so that it didn't move around while it was in storage. And then since this original bow tie couldn't go on display, I created a dicky and then a custom diamond point bow tie based on a bunch of images that I found of him in 1865, the year before he died. And then finally, I created a mannequin that I looked up his height and I looked up his weight. And so I kind of made this mannequin so it could custom fit these sets of garments. And so these, I think, are on display in Ford's Theater in DC. But if not, they're safely in storage in Ford's Theater. Another brief treatment that I did there was the Civil War era camp stool, and it was very composite. It had wood and canvas and leather and metal components. And some of the things that I did was tone or paint little pieces of paper and adhere to them, glued them down to these leather parts because some of the leather had flaked off. And so these papers were making it to look just a little less like it was falling apart. And then I also stabilized this crack in the leg and scraped in some beeswax that was toned to match the wood, again, so that it looked a little more whole while it was on display. So after the Park Service, I moved to Chicago, Illinois to work for the Field Museum, a natural history museum. And while the Park Service internship was really focused on hands-on treatment, on bench work, this internship was focused on preventive conservation or taking care of the objects while they're in storage, like preventing damage from happening to them. So my project there was to rehouse 200 woven Pacific mats. So woven mats made out of plant fiber that came from the Pacific Islands. And they had been rolled onto small tubes made of cardboard that was really acidic. And unfortunately, plant fiber and acidic materials don't really mix. If you have plant fibers in contact with acidic materials, the acids will break down the plant fibers and they'll become more and more brittle and fragile and eventually fall apart. So I unrolled the plant fiber mats off of the bad tubes, created new tubes, and rolled them back on to those new tubes. And another part of this, oh, this is all of them going back into storage. There were a lot. Another part of this was to create 3D models of each of the mats using this process called photogrammetry. And these 3D models allow researchers who are interested in the mats to first look at the models because they're very high definition and see if they can answer their questions just by looking at the models. And then if they do need to actually touch the mats, then they can go and unroll them. But the models reduce the instances of the mats being unrolled and re-rolled, which reduces the amount of damage that they might undergo. Finally, my last pre-program conservation position was at Yale University. And while there, I worked for Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. And this was kind of a science lab, basically. So my first internship was treatment, my second was preventive, and then this one was focused on conservation science. And I worked under conservation scientists or trained chemists and physicists who use all of their knowledge to analyze artworks. So I trained on instruments like these. As I'm speaking, look at these, and I'm really interested if you have used any of these in your careers, in your lives, because these are used in industry and used outside of this field. But within the field of art conservation, all of these techniques are utilized to analyze artwork and answer questions that researchers have about artworks. So I worked on projects like analyzing the materiality of an ancient Egyptian bracelet, kind of to answer the question like what these materials are and if they align with literature on what the materials used in ancient Egypt were. I also analyzed different things like Indian yellow paint, a rare paint that is used in a lot of watercolors that are currently on view at the British Art Gallery at Yale. And oh my goodness, excuse me. I also worked on an Assyrian relief project. And so the institute that I worked at had these huge gypsum Assyrian reliefs come to them. And the question that was asked was, are there any pigments remaining on these reliefs? And this is a good question because they used to be brightly painted. There used to be a lot of pigment there. But as a result of really intensive and invasive cleaning in previous years, all the pigment is gone, at least visually. So our lab used every tool in our arsenal to understand whether we could find any small traces of pigments. And the fun thing is that we did actually using a technique called macro X-ray fluorescence, which maps out elements that are present in the artwork we're looking at. So in this little spot, we found mercury and we found gold as well. And so both of these, well, mercury is a component of a red pigment called cinnabar or vermilion. It's a mercuric sulfide pigment. And then gold obviously was gold. So we took this information and gave it to an institution at Yale, and they now have the reliefs up and they have a light projector projecting color onto the reliefs that hopefully aligned with what they used to look like based on the research that we did. So this was a really great experience because it taught me about all of the questions that one can ask and answer using scientific analysis. So after Yale, I had finished my coursework requirements, I had put together my art portfolio, and I had finished my set number of hours in a conservation lab. And I applied to and got accepted to graduate school here at the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. So I am currently in my second year at Woodpack. And this year, each member, oh, I'm sorry, let me go back. Each cohort of the Woodpack has 10 students, and each of these students have different backgrounds. Some come from science backgrounds, chemistry or biology, and many come from studio art or art history backgrounds like myself. So during our first year, the 10 of us participate in 10 month-long sessions where we take an intense deep dive into the materiality, the historical context, and the treatment of different conservation specializations that we just talked about. And during each of these blocks, we are taught by a conservator in that specialization. We also have chemistry course. We perform photo documentation where we learn how to best document the objects that we're looking at. And we also have a lot of different hands-on projects that expose us to the craft techniques behind the materials that we're looking at. So now I'm in my second year, and this year involves conservation treatments. Each of the members of the cohort have picked our conservation specialization, and we are given treatments in that specialization. We also perform scientific analysis, or we have a research project, and we have seminars that kind of educate us on various aspects of this specialization. And we can take an elective. And this is a slide from the elective I took last year, which was focused on performing art historical research into an object that I'm treating, and kind of getting more of the connoisseurship and the art history side of that, in addition to the materials aspect that I'm learning about in class. So this year I'm working on 6 projects. I'm just going to talk very briefly about a couple of them so you can see what I'm working on. So this object is a set of beads from the Penn Museum, and it came to us with almost no information. I did know it was archaeological. I knew it was from Honduras, but I didn't know what the materials were made of. I didn't know what the beads were made of. So in the process of working on this object, I have kind of hypothesized that they're made of shell based on my research and based on some hands-on experimentation. And I have been cleaning them, but I've also been proposing research analyses to perform on them to answer more questions, to answer whether or not the beads are actually made of shell, to figure out what kind of other materials exist on the beads, because I think I found some pigments inside each of the beads. So we're going to do some more analyses. And this is kind of a great representation of an object that was designed or that is collected in order for research to occur on it, because it belongs to the Penn Museum, and the Penn Museum is really focused on education and research. So this this project is very research heavy. Another project that I'm working on is an organic material. It's leather. It's a patent model from the Hagley Museum, if you've ever been there. And the desire for this object is for it to kind of become a bit more clean. It was super, super grimy, super dirty. So I've done some cleaning on it to remove that grime. And then also there's a lot of corrosion. If you can see kind of around the top of the bag, there's a ferrous metal or maybe piece of iron that has been painted that is now corroding and the paint's falling off. So something I'm going to do is remove that corrosion and make sure that paint stays stable and doesn't keep flaking off. And then the leather is also a little bit deformed. It's a little curvy, a little more curvy than the patent model image is shown to be. So I'm going to humidify the leather, soften it a little bit, and then reshape it so that it looks a little bit more hefty and sturdy. So that is one project I'm working on. And then another one is something I'm doing in conjunction with my classmates. This is a bark cloth, or a siapo from American Samoa. And this project is designed for us to learn how to collaborate or connect with members of the community that the object is from, and jointly in collaboration with them decide on the proper conservation treatment or a potential conservation treatment. So my goal or my responsibility in this project is to connect with to kind of lead the consultation with the maker or the siapo maker that we're going to be talking to. And I'm really excited about that because I've never done something like that before. I'm excited to learn more about how to best collaborate with people to decide on a proper conservation treatment moving forward. And finally, this is another thing that involves consultation, but I'm going to be speaking with an artist, Allison Rossiter, about her piece. These are textile hangings that were made at the Fabric Museum in Philly. And there's a really strong adhesive or glue that was put on the top of the hangings to allow them to hang, but that wasn't ever designed to be there. So that adhesive needs to be removed. So I'm going to be sitting down with the artist and asking her kind of what's the best way to move forward? Do we want the adhesive to be removed? And if so, what's the appropriate amount of change that she would be okay with for this artwork? So those are my projects, some of them, and that is how one becomes a conservator. But the final question is, why does this matter? Why are we doing this? Um, in like this world where we have tons of things we can be thinking about, the world needs to be conserved. Why do we spend years of our lives taking care of things like leather patent models or pieces of bark cloth? And I do think it all comes back to what we talked about at the beginning of this session. Why do objects matter? I believe that objects are really powerful. They make us feel things. Objects can cultivate individual identity. Think about the things that you have in your house right now and why you have them. Maybe you have them because they make you feel more like yourself, or they are a part of making who you are. Um, Maybe they represent places you've been, people you've known, and are now a part of who you are becoming. They can tell our own stories to other people, and other people's objects tell their stories to us. So there's a lot of storytelling happening when we engage with objects. And this can build a communal identity. If you have a group of people who all have a shared experience that surrounds an object or a series of objects, this creates community. And then this is why objects matter. This is why I believe objects matter, because they're powerful. But then why does the physical act of conservation and preservation matter? Why do we like spend this much time, and is there any value in it? I think that conservators, when we spend hours, weeks, years of our life really carefully researching, analyzing, taking care of objects, that lends a lot of dignity to the object itself, but also to the people to whom that object matters. This intentional effort really lends value to the object and the people. It also, as we've talked about, conservation in a modern sense involves collaboration and connection with a wide variety of people, descendant communities, artists, personal like clients, owners of the object. And so this creates a connection of care, a relationship that involves repair and love and like caring. And then finally, like I felt with Abraham Lincoln's garments, we as the conservators are able to experience a lot of awe, a lot of beauty, and a lot of connection with the objects and then the people. So there's something personal that I get from performing conservation and doing conservation in the lab. So this is where I come to a close, and I want to say that while conservators perform preservation and conservation really overtly, it's kind of in our name. I do believe that everyone, wherever we are, is here on this earth to conserve, to connect, to repair whatever we're doing, wherever we're at. And I hope that coming out of this talk, we're all able to see places in our lives where we can connect, repair, and conserve. And one last thing, I said I was done, but I'm not. If you want to learn more about conservation and what conservation entails, I created a blog that described kind of a week in my life as a first year student. And then I also recorded a podcast episode with my classmate, Caitlin Fong, who will be speaking next week. So if you have your phones and can scan a QR code, I'll leave this up for a minute if you're interested in looking at those things. And then that's it. I'm going to end here and I'll open it up for questions.
Yes, Leah, I thought that was really excellent and very comprehensive, certainly about conservation and quite interesting as well. So if people have questions, they can ask them either on chat, put a question on chat, which we will read or have you read, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand, and you can get to that through React. So we're more than happy to have questions. Judy?
First of all, your background is incredible. It's just unbelievable. It's amazing. And your presentation was great. I've seen a lot of the patents at Hagley. Why would there be a patent for a bag? Do you have any reason for that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked because I did breeze through that. But the patent itself, I'm actually going to go back. The patent is for not the bag, but the metal attachments around the top. So
Oh,
this patent was patented in 1878, and this is around the time when cross-country railroad travel began to become more popular. So people were bringing handbags rather than larger suitcases because they could go places faster. But the problem with handbags is that they're easier to steal. So around this time, a lot of patents started cropping up for how to secure your handbag, maybe to like the seat that you're sitting on. So this metal thing at the bottom would hook around at the top, and there would be a chain. That chain there would be the connection point, and you would put the chain around like your handrail. So this is a safety kind of mechanism for the patent model. Thank you for asking.
and not just one real quick question. I've been involved in museum work for a long time. Wonder when things ever get thrown out.
Oh, that's also such a great question. I would say my hot take is not as often as they should,
Yeah.
or the museums have a huge collections. And when I was at the Field Museum, I did some like cleaning and housekeeping in their back rooms in their collection spaces. And it was just things that would never be put on display. They're never going to be put on display because there's so many things there. Um, so sometimes there's a process called deaccessioning where
Yeah.
the museum decides to formally get rid of an object, but that process takes a long time, and that often doesn't happen because it takes so long. But a plug for next week's talk is that my classmate Caitlin Fong will be talking about how we ourselves, if we have too many items, can figure out how to deaccession our own items and figure out how to give those away. So the answer to your question is getting rid of museum objects is difficult, so it often
Yeah.
doesn't happen.
Thank you.
Linda, I see your hands raised.
Linda?
Yeah, thank you. It was a wonderful talk. And the question I have for you came to me kind of early in your presentation when you were talking about the importance of maintaining humidity, temperature, and all kinds of things which are necessary for the good preservation of objects. I remember when the Brandywine River Museum was affected by the flooding in a storm about 4 or 5 years ago, and very fortunately, they apparently have a vault in which their paintings are kept, and therefore the paintings were not affected. But it made me wonder at that time, I know there are a lot of things in museums which are not on display.
Mm.
Are all of those things kept in a really well climate controlled vault or place where they are preserved as well as what the things are on the wall or on the museum floor?
That's such a good question. And a common answer you'll hear in conservation for any question is it depends. Like it really does depend on the institution. It takes a lot of money to maintain the like the proper quote unquote environmental conditions for every object. And also every object's needs are slightly different. So it takes a lot of resources to make that happen, to have everything in the perfect condition. A question that we as conservators or conservation students ask when we're sending something back to an institution is like, what is your environmental conditions like? Do you have humidity control? Do you have an HVAC system? What is the shelving like? Do you have like cabinets or is it open shelving? So that's a question that we're always asking because it fluctuates so much from institution to institution. I think the larger the institution, it might be safe to say the better their housing is because the more resources they have. But yeah, oftentimes it's not the same level of uh, yeah, preventive care if the institution doesn't have that many resources, which can be okay. Sometimes like it could be okay that objects are kept in a non ideal situation. But that's a great question. Stu, I see your hand raised as well.
Yeah, this may be a bit off topic, but it winds up being personal to me. When I started with engineering and working for DuPont, I was in a field where people used paper tape to save materials.
Mm,
And that was miserable material stuff because it easily broke. But then a few years later, they moved on with the technology to small discs. And I said, my, that's great. I could really do something with that. And I had my parents make comments for my kids about on the discs.
mm,
And then the discs disappeared.
mm.
And is that part of the field of conservation, or is that
Mm.
fit somewhere else?
Oh, that's such a good question. I feel like as you're speaking, I was thinking like that's a core concept in time-based media conservation is obsolescence of technology. And how, yeah, how do you source enough of the like enough repeated materials so that even if something becomes obsolete, you have a stash of those discs or how to read those discs. I'm trying to think of the field that is responsible for that, but I know that there are people who like are on the internet trying to make sure that internet web pages are stay around forever because everything is constantly changing. But yeah, I think that is part of the field of conservation, but I think there's also another field that exists that I don't remember the name of, but that's such a good point. And did you ever figure out how to transfer that information from the discs?
Unfortunately, no. It was small and there's no equipment to do anything with it.
Hmm.
So it was very disappointing, but it was certainly better than paper tape.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I wonder if you can find something on eBay to read the discs and then digitize it.
There's a company, Digital Transfer Stuff 1202, that does stuff, all kinds of stuff, Stu. You ought to check them out.
Hmm.
They do all kinds of transfers.
Well, I no longer have the discs,
Hmm.
Oh, okay.
unfortunately.
Okay,
Thank
Fritz,
you.
before I get to you, let me just read a few things online. Liz Reed said you are preserving history. History matters. How can we know where to go if we don't know where we've been? Well, if you want to comment on any of this, you're welcome. Welcome, Leah. But I mean, obviously, it's a very, very good point. Mary Kay writes, "Hi, wonderful presentation. Thank you. How do I get a copy of this presentation recording?" Well, it was recorded, and Stu, the recording is available. Does everybody get a copy of it, or do you have to ask? Stu?
Stu can send them out. Put your email on the chat and people can ask you to send them the presentation.
Right. Send, you can send something, I believe, to Stu, and it'll arrange for you to get a copy of the recording.
He has to put his email on the chat.
Right. Yes. Fritz?
I don't see anybody.
Unmuting here. I have a couple of questions. I'm a librarian by former occupation. I'm retired now, but I worked at the University of Delaware Library and also volunteered at the Hagley Museum printed collection, which is not the archives. It's basically the library.
Mm.
At the University of Delaware, they have a very extensive special collections area, which you may be aware of. And this is more of a comment than a question. I knew that there was some archival material on 5¼ discs. And at one point when I was changing computers and I still had a drive, I gave them my drive. So they would have a 5 1/4 drive. And I think they do use it. At Hagley, two things. Yeah, they never throw anything out. I've been in the stacks a lot of times, and if I were a librarian in control, I would probably deaccession more stuff than they're willing to do. So that's that point. The other point is I was assigned to rehouse the microform collection, the reels of microfilm. We used acid-free boxes, and I just stacked them in there and documented everything on a computer, a mini computer. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, that's such good collections management practice, and that's so fair. Yeah, Hagley, they love their objects, and I think yeah, it's hard to know how much to keep, how much to release, and when you have something in a collection, it's like it feels to me like automatically it becomes more valuable. We have it in our collection, like this is a museum collection now. So yeah, keeping and giving away objects is difficult. Thank you for
Oh, one
sharing.
more thing. It was 55 degrees in the stacks. The elves had to wear a jacket.
Yeah, yeah, keep that
Speaking
temperature
of
down.
taking care of things, yeah.
Mm. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah,
That's so interesting.
Eileen, you have something you'd like to share?
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question on one of the slides you showed. You talked about the 10 agents of deterioration.
Mm.
I just didn't get all of them. Can you either show that slide one more time or
Let me
repeat?
pull that up. Yeah, that's a great
Thank you.
point. And if you Google 10 agents, you can, I'm going to pull it up, but also if you want to save the image, it's a really fun image. Okay, where is it? Where are we at? Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Share. And then we have this. Yeah, so they're listed down here. Pollutants, fire, pests, light levels, temperature, relative humidity, dissociation. And like all of these things, it's not like, oh, if you have any humidity, then your object is going to die. It's each object has like its own range of like proper or ideal relative humidity or proper or ideal temperature. I do think if you have theft or vandalism, that is a net negative. Actually, no, I'll hold that. I take that back. Okay, anyway, Eileen, does that answer your question? Does that get you what you need? Oops.
Yes, what is disassociation? Just
Yes. Dissociation is when you have a record for an object saying like when it was accessioned, what year it's from, what culture, and yeah, more information about that. That is connected to the object, like on a tag or it's in a database. And dissociation happens when that information gets separated from the object. There's no object number on the object. There's no tag, or the thing in the database doesn't have a picture on it, so you don't know what object it goes to. So dissociation was an information and objects get separated.
thank you. And your presentation was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you,
Good luck
Eileen.
in your career.
Jan Jessup, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I wanted to share something that I experienced last year on a trip to Portugal. I was at the University of Coimbra, which is one of their oldest universities, in a beautiful library that was a few hundred years old, magnificent woodwork and antique volumes on the shelves. And I was really surprised to learn that there is a colony of bats that live in the rafters at the university, because at night they come out and eat pests and bugs that protect the volumes.
Yeah, it's amazing. Did you see them?
Well, no, because we were there in the daytime, so they were, sleeping, and but they also, open windows, so that they can kind of come and go a bit. So, they don't have a lot of temperature control, but the bats take care of things for them. So
Yes. Yeah, that's like such a good example of like if it works for your collection, that's great.
Right.
Like maybe in other spaces you wouldn't want to have bats, but maybe in this space it's really, really great.
Yes.
That's such a great
Okay,
story.
thank you, Jan. I, Leah, I have a collection of books, and in particular, I have one book that's from the 16th century. What's the best way for me to, keep it in good condition?
Hmm. That's a great question. It would depend. We would need a library archives conservator to think about that. So my answer, take it with a grain of salt. But I think that one of the best things you can do for objects that are sensitive, I'm assuming is it parchment?
Well, it's 16th century. It's not parchment, it's paper.
Paper. Great.
But
So
a
paper
leather,
is, go ahead, sorry.
no, I think it's a I'm not there now, but I think it's a leather cover
Mhm.
and paper.
Yeah, well, leather and paper are both quite sensitive to moisture. And so one way and light. So one way you could care for it is to make sure it's in kind of a dry-ish space. Having it in a box is good because that buffers the book against any drastic changes in temperature or relative humidity. You just have another layer of protection. Um, and when you use it, or I wouldn't leave it kind of directly in the light because light causes photooxidation of the materials in leather and paper, which makes everything become more brittle and more readily able to fall apart. So those are two things I would say is make sure it's not in like direct sunlight all the time. I'm sure maybe it is, maybe it's not. And then also if you are just storing it kind of out of sight, maybe put it in a box so that the fluctuations in humidity and temperature don't affect it as much. Where is it now? Is it on a shelf or?
God. It's on a bookshelf, and I don't know whether this is good or not, but it's in a paper bag.
No, Michael, you need to get an acid-free box.
Okay,
Acid-free.
I hear you. Very good. Okay, we'll do the best we can.
Yeah, and also like if you like to have it on your shelf and that's what's important to you, like keep it on the shelf. If you like seeing it, that's huge. Don't hide it away just to make
Right.
sure. I don't know. Depends on what you value about the object.
Right. Kathleen,
Oh, sorry.
you gotta unmute. You have to, there we go.
Sorry. I wanted to comment, a couple years ago, Winter Tour had a community conservation clinic, and I don't know if they continue to do that, but that would be a place where Michael could take his book and get the conservation students to give him feedback on care.
Yes, that's a
have
good
it?
point. Thank you for highlighting that. I don't know when the dates are on the next ones, but I can find out and send it to whoever's in charge of this and get it out to you. But yes, in those conservation clinics, the Winter conservators and then some of us students are at tables and according to specialization. So you could go to the library archives conservator, Crystal, and ask her what to do with this book. And she would definitely be able to give you a much better and more comprehensive answer. Thank you, Kathleen. Have you been to one of the
Yes,
clinics?
I have. I had an oil painting that they had me move to a different room and various and sundry other suggestions for conservating this older painting. Yeah, thank you.
Jan? You have
Hi,
another-
I'll just add that for the bibliophiles, yesterday I was at the Delaware Art Museum, and in their library and their rare books room, they have about 40,000 volumes there. And I was shown their oldest volume, which dates from 1571, and they did keep it in an acid-free box. But they also recently inherited 4,000 volumes of books that had decorative bindings.
Whoa.
the Sawyer collection. And we forget that books, didn't always have paper wrappers to sell them. It was the binding, the leather cover, and whatever artwork was imprinted on it that helped sell the book. And so these are volumes that have those kinds of really valuable covers. And so it was really interesting to see that. That's another place you could visit for those who have special books to get advice on how to care for them, store them, and preserve them.
Where do you buy a box?
Online, Michael.
Okay,
Online. There's lots of sources.
thank you. Okay, Linda, did you have another question?
I did, but I wanted to make sure that everyone else who hadn't had a chance to ask one
Right.
had their chance. My question was just reflecting back on your pre-program experiences when you were at Yale. You listed about 15 different types of analytical tools, machines, microscopes, and various things. Were you trained in many of those or just as needed? How did they handle that?
Yeah, definitely it was project-based. So whenever a project came into the lab, like, okay, so there's one called, macro X-ray fluorescence. So one of my first days I was there, there's this huge instrument that was there's a big painting being put under that instrument. And so I was called into the room and they're like, okay, here's all the buttons you press. Here's the concept behind how X-ray fluorescence works. And it was such a cool experience because each of my supervisors were really amazingly trained. They have crazy backgrounds and they were sometimes professors in their past life. So they would sit down with me for like half hour at a time and draw diagrams of like, this is how this works. So I'm really thankful to have gotten that experience. I was thinking the other day, it is tough because that was such a concentrated year of conservation science. And now that was everything I did for a year. And now that's not something I do every day. So I need to revisit all of my notes to make sure everything stays fresh. But it was such a cool experience.
People online have mentioned that the next conservation clinic at Winterthur is March 6th, my mother's birthday, and a place where I can and others get archival storage boxes, gaylord.com. Anyway, Leah, it's time for us to end this, but I want to thank you very much. Linda, did you want to say anything?
Only that I very much, and I think I can speak for the whole class, very much enjoyed the thoroughness with which you presented this topic and giving your own background and why it's so important for everyone to appreciate this culturally and in other aspects. We thank you very much for offering this talk today.
Thank you all for being such an amazing audience. I really appreciate all your questions.
Well, thank you very much. And next week we have Leah's friend, right?
Yeah.
Who'll be speaking to us and talking about conservation as well. Okay. Anyway, thank all of you for coming this morning, which is almost afternoon. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks again, Leah. Be safe, everybody.
Thank you. Excellent.
Okay.